Hey everyone, this is Dr. Sean, and in today's lesson we'll be discussing the Ponziani opening. The moves follow as pawn to e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and the special key move, pawn to c3. Now, there's a few ways black can respond to the Ponziani opening, which are knight f6, bishop c5, pawn d6, and pawn d5. So there are four ways black can typically respond to the Ponziani opening. In today's lesson, I'll discuss the most common response, and in another video, I'll discuss the remaining responses. So the most common response to the Ponziani opening is knight f6, and it pretty much makes sense that majority of our opponents are going to play knight f6. They're developing a knight prior to a bishop, one step closer of them castling. They're attacking our poisonous pawn or a pawn which is not defended. And normally, when you move a pawn once, the idea behind that is to launch the other one twice. Now, when black looks at this, he or she is wondering, what? Isn't this a free pawn? Or wait, maybe there's a trap. I could also maybe take the other one. So in this position, it doesn't matter whether or not our opponent takes our poisonous pawn or the pawn which is not defended, or they take the other pawn, we'll have a winning, comfortable game. Now, let's say they take our poisonous pawn. Haha, I'm up a point. They lost. You always win with a pawn push. That's a winning move. Now, will black assume we're going to play pawn d5, a pawn push? No, they're assuming we're going to capture this pawn either with the pawn, or we're gonna capture the pawn with the knight. So when we hit our opponent with neither and with a pawn push, like, whoa, what was that? Now, they have two responses to the pawn push. They can play either knight to a5, which is bad because knight on the rim is dim, or they can play knight e7. It doesn't matter whether or not they go to a5 or they go to e7. Both moves are clearly losing. Let's say, for example, they play knight a5. The reason they make the slogan "Knight on the rim is dim" is because once we launch the b pawn, that's it, you win the knight. There's no way they can survive a launch of a pawn like this. Remember, if they go knight c6, they're down 3 points. If they go knight c4, also down 3 points. If they go knight b3, either we can capture with the pawn or the queen, will also be up 3 points. So they cannot go to the rim. So what's the only other move they have? Knight e7. But the good news is, when the knight was here on c6, it was protecting the e5 pawn. Since it's no longer there, we can just go ahead and take the e5 pawn. Now here, if you look at this position, we're clearly winning. So even though we're not up any points, what do we have that black doesn't have? We have something that's called harmony. We have our bishops, which are active. They can move freely. Our queen. We have a pawn on the knight on the fifth rank, which is our outpost. We have a very nice pawn that restricts black's harmony. And if you take a look at black, the bishop can't move. Their other bishop can't move. Their queen is stuck. Their knight in the middle is useless. So we're dominating our opponent in several moves positionally. Now here, black typically makes this one blunder. I would say majority of your chess players will always make this blunder, which is pawn to d6, because they're telling us, you know what, your knight is on an outpost, get out of here. But the beautiful thing is, when there's an opening, good idea to give your opponent a check. So we're going to give our opponent a check. Now, it doesn't matter how they block, it's clearly losing. For black, they can block with the bishop, they'll lose this game. They can block with the knight, they'll lose this game. And their best block, and they'll still lose, is they can block with the pawn. Now, let's look at the first one. If they block the check with the bishop, it's automatically a loss for black. We're simply going to do bishop takes bishop check, and no matter what, they force to lose their queen. Queen takes, knight takes, king takes, and here we're up 6 points, so we're dominating in points, and our position is extravagant. Because remember, the king can never castle once it moves, and we could simply castle. So they're going to lose if they go there. Now, another way that they can block this check, which is as equally horrible, is knight to c6. Now, this is an easy decision because we have 1, 2, 3 attackers. Our opponent only has one defender, so anytime you have more attackers than your opponent has defenders, that's simply our piece. And how do we capture? Always with the lowest value piece. So what do? Pawn takes knight, we up 3 points, and once they take our knight, which is a fair trade, 3 for 3, here we just have a simply beautiful tactic. Anything in front of the laser beam, which is our bishop, that something should be moved. What do? Hit them with the reveal, discovery. Pawn takes pawn, check, and now when they block, you can win multiple ways. It's kind of like pick your poison. What I personally like to do is queen takes bishop, check, that's a force move. If you want, you can make a queen, or if you want to keep it simple, capture their bishop, they'll lose castling rights, and you make obviously a queen and you win this game. So from here, once you give this reveal once again, and they block with the bishop, it's pretty much pick your poison. If you want, you could do bishop for bishop, you could do queen for bishop. That's basically checkmate. They have to give this up. You want to make a queen and then capture the bishop after. You want to capture the queen first and then make a queen. You're just up 14 points no matter what, and you're dominating your opponent. Now from here, we discussed they can't block with the bishop, they'll lose. They cannot block with the knight, so their best block, which is still losing for black, is pawn c6. Now, the same concept. Before we touch a piece, we have to ask ourselves how many attackers we have on the piece versus how many defenders our opponent has to that piece. So here, if we look, we have 1, 2, 3 attackers. And how many defenders does black have? 1, 2. So if we have more attackers than they have defenders, we already know that's our piece. Now, concept number 2, since we know that's our piece, what do we use to capture that pawn? Obviously, our lowest value piece, which is the pawn. So if we take 1, here there's 2 ways black can play. One is a greedy way, which they'll lose immediately, and the other way is not a greedy way, but they'll lose a little bit after. The greedy way here is they can take the knight or capture the knight, and that's a simply losing move because you're like, hold on, I could beat you 2 ways. I can capture the pawn, give you a check, win the rook, or I could just simply do a pawn push, and no matter how you block this check, I'm winning your queen. Doesn't matter what you do. You can block with the bishop, I'll win your queen. You can block with the knight, I'll win your queen. You want to put your queen in the line of fire, I'll win your queen. Now, some opponents in this position, they're like, oh, Sean, this is winning, but can I win with this move? Oh, absolutely, because once you take this pawn and give them a check, and let's say they block, you could simply win with queen takes bishop, check. They'll take, and if you want to keep it simple, you could capture their queen, win the rook, or if you want to capture the rook first, give them a check, and then win the queen. It wouldn't matter from this position. You can win many different ways. What do I personally recommend? I just like this. Just do a pawn push and go ahead and just win the queen. Doesn't matter how they block. Keep life simple. Now, if we go ahead and take this pawn once again, which we're supposed to, and they do not get greedy, which they're not because they can't afford to get greedy, this is such a deadly pawn push, and they capture correctly with their b pawn, the same question we ask. How many attackers do we have on that c6 pawn versus how many defenders do they have to their c6 pawn? And here we have 1, 2 attackers, and our opponent has 1 defender. Now here, obviously we know that's our pawn because we have more attackers than them, but here's a tricky question because we have 2 pieces that are worth the same. They're both minor pieces, they're both worth 3. And a lot of people say, hey, Dr. Sean, you said with the lowest value piece, you capture your opponent's piece. Yeah, but sometimes there's exceptions. If you have 2 pieces and they're both worth the same, you have to now contemplate which one is better to capture that pawn with. Now, the rule of thumb is you always want to put something, doesn't matter what it is, in front of our bishop, which is the laser beam. Doesn't matter if it's a pawn in front of the bishop, doesn't matter if it's a knight in front of the bishop, or rook in front of the bishop. You always want to put something in front of the bishop so you could always use that as reveals against your opponent. So take a look at this. We're going to capture this pawn. And now here black pretty much has 2 moves. I would say over 90% of your opponents will take the knight, and maybe 10% are not going to take our knight but played queen b6. Both are clearly losing, so let's say the 90% decide to take the knight. we're going to take back the knight with a check. And here, once they block their check, we have a decision. Either to capture their rook, either to capture their bishop, or either to capture their knight. Now here, the rule of thumb is points go above everything in chess. Like a lot of people, when they look at this, oh, Sean, take the rook, it's worth 5 points. Well, if you take 5 points and their queen takes 3 points, you're only up 2 points. But if you go ahead and take the knight, you're up 3 points. You're up an additional point. Now, the only way that black could kind of confuse us and scare us and maybe tie this game is to obviously pin her bishop, because they're saying, you know what, I don't give you permission to capture my rook, and if you're not careful, you're going to lose the bishop. Now, the rule is anytime you're pinned to your king, which means your piece is frozen because everything circles around your king in the line of fire, all you have to do to unpin is get out of the line of fire. Simply castle. Now, if your opponent gets greedy, oh, thank you for the bishop. You're like, no, thank you. And you're going to always win the queen, because what you do, you pin their queen to their king. Now, from this position, you're probably wondering, hold on, Sean, I got it. You're saying if they capture my knight, I capture back and I'll win the knight, and as long as I unpin, I'm winning in points and position, I'll win that game with these. But let's say you have that one player, or that 10% of chess players that do not take their knight, but they move their queen instead. Well, this is pretty easy. You're like, hold on, wait, this is a massive threat. Attacker on the bishop, a second attacker on the knight, and also there's a checkmate on f2. So you have to make a move where you save your knight, you save your bishop, and you protect that check. And the way you do that is anything in front of laser beam should be moved for the reveal. So knight e4. What are we doing? Stopping the checkmate. Knight is protected, bishop is protected, and you're giving a check. And as soon as they block, you're like, hold on, I'm up a point. When you're winning, you want to simplify, because the less pieces your opponent has, the less he or she can do to you. So what do you want to do? Bishop take bishop, king takes back. And now here, you're up a point. Obviously, you want to hit them with queen g4 and try to win this knight, but safety first. Let's castle. And as soon as they make a subtle move, then queen g4 is simply winning. So if they block, you're like, I got one attacker, two attackers, they have one defender. Oh, free piece, thank you. And once they capture, and we recapture check, we win the knight. And this is clearly winning. So it doesn't really matter what they play in the poison pawn variation when they take that freebie. No matter what, white will always win. Now, in the next lesson, I'll discuss what happens when they take the non-poison pawn or the other pawn. Thank you, everyone, and this is Dr. Sean. Take care.